for joining us for tonight's event on the new translation of Charles Baudelaire's The Flowers of Evil. For those who aren't familiar, The Flowers of Evil is considered to be Baudelaire's most significant achievement. In the introduction to the new translation, Dana Joya writes that Baudelaire's entire reputation rests on this one single work. Indeed, Baudelaire would spend much of his life going back to this collection, tinkering and retinkering until there was enough material to produce 3 separate editions. Baudelaire roots his poems in the merge between brutal modernity and the sublime. As the first modern poet, he's known for his revolutionary pairings of the grotesque with the beautiful, evil with grace, and the fall of humanity with transcendent delight. It is a profoundly ambitious work of literature, and it is equally ambitious to translate it. We're very excited to have Aaron Poochigian with us tonight, the translator of the new edition, who is here to discuss the challenges and joys of working on such an important project. Poochigian has published 4 books of poetry, including American Divine, which won the 2020 Richard Wilbur Poetry Award, and has also published several translations. We also have with us Saul Anton, who is the author of Lee Friedlander, The Little Screens, and the experimental critical fiction Warhol's Dream. His articles and essays about contemporary art and culture have appeared in Art Forum, Frieze, Book Forum, After All, Bomb, and many other publications. Just a reminder to everyone that there will be a Q&A at the end of the event, so if you have any questions during the discussion, please send them to evan@192books.com. So without any further ado, I will now hand it over to Aaron and Saul. Thank you so much.
I guess I should start, Aaron. First of all, obviously, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about Baudelaire. This was really a lovely opportunity to refamiliarize myself with his work, and I'm really excited to hear about your experience with the translation. One of the funny things about Baudelaire is that I happened to teach him in a class this semester on horror and monstrosity, which is one of the more popular classes where I teach. Not because I teach it, it's taught by more than one person, but it is basically a class that's always full no matter who teaches it, which tells me that the sensibility that I sort of imagined is Baudelaire's on some level, is, you know, sort of unflagging and powerful amongst the youth. And so I think it's really interesting and timely that you decided to translate this book. Maybe I just would start by just saying a few things about Baudelaire that seem relevant. First of all, it's interesting that he was born 200 years ago. I know you noted this in your article about him in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So that's, you know, not a small period of time. It's quite substantial. And so it really raises an interesting question about the fact that there's this writer and poet who worked quite a long time ago, who remains in all sorts of ways, you know, really relevant and really contemporary for us today. And I was hoping that that's something we could talk about. He was largely in his lifetime known not so much as a poet. That's a reputation that he developed pretty much after his death. But really as an art critic and a critic. And so this is something he started doing in his 20s. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of just point out that his first salon, that's what the critical writings that he published were known as in 1845, he holds up Eugene Delacroix as this kind of great example for him. And the reason he does so is because he contrasts him with other artists. In particular, he's interested in Delacroix's use of color and feeling. Delacroix is the kind of leader of the Romantic school at that time. But what's interesting about that is that when he talks about color, he associates it with nature, but this is the kind of this is the kind of understanding of nature that seems to be already, this is in his early 20s, already at this time, very much divorced from the kind of traditional ideas of nature that Romanticism upheld. He says, I want to sort of quote here, that a colorist like Delacroix treats nature as harmony, melody, and counterpoint. And it's this kind of interesting idea that nature is this whole, but it's a whole that doesn't sort of exist as a kind of trans-historical ideal, something that God created for us to celebrate in all the traditional ways that idea existed, but rather it exists to sort of produce a memory, he says. And so the kind of a key term that he introduces right from his early days as a writer is this idea of memory. Now, the other thing that's sort of interesting is that in 1846, he dedicates his salon to the bourgeois, right? And this is a term, obviously, it's a little bit dated. It's a very much a 19th century term. And he writes, he dedicates his salon of 1846 to the bourgeois. And he says, it's because any book that doesn't address itself to the majority, i.e. the majority being the dominant sort of cultural force in 19th century France, in number and intelligence, he says, is stupid, right? So he's really committed to this idea that a book should address itself to the majority. And what I find fascinating is that the word stupid, la sottise, is the first word in Les Fleurs du Mal. That he starts with when he writes the poem to the reader. And so this is a kind of an interesting sort of connection that one starts with, because it's not the kind of idea that one associates with poets, right? They're generally not obsessed with stupidity, but rather with intelligence. And for Baudelaire, these things kind of like, he wants to think about intelligence, obviously, but he thinks about it through its opposite on some level. And his opposite as a figure in culture is the bourgeois who works 6 days a week, I guess in the 19th century, who goes home, reads the newspaper, but on Sunday, he wants a little bit of culture. I'm kind of paraphrasing Baudelaire. And so he wants to have an experience, but not too much of an experience. This is the figure who Baudelaire imagines to be his ideal reader, who he kind of addresses in the first poem. And I don't know, I just thought it would be something to start with. There's a lot of things we can say about Baudelaire. And because he's such a named sort of phenomenon, we can talk about, all the cliches that one associates with Baudelaire. The fact that he's the poet maudit, the cursed poet, his interest in all the things of all the aspects of modernity that we nowadays, very much associate with the subjects of cultural production, sexuality, the experience of the body, the city, obviously, all these motifs. And what I find interesting, but maybe we can get into all this without sort of rehashing it all together. But what I find interesting, Aaron, is that you are trained as a classicist. And so all this stuff I've been talking about Baudelaire is very much antithetical on some level to classicism. So I thought maybe you can start by talking about how you got to Baudelaire, because in some ways it's a funny choice. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you, Saul, for that introduction. Yes, I always, even when an undergraduate, had a certain obsession with Baudelaire, and it's only gotten greater over the years. And so as I was learning Latin, I would purchase dual language editions of his work that had the French en face with the English, and I would try to parse it out. And so slowly over the decades, I got better at that. And as I say, I don't know French so much as I know Baudelaire at this point. But Baudelaire as you well know, was quite a classical scholar himself. He won an award for composing verses in Latin at his high school before he was kicked out of it, and then had to finish up at home. And so also, in another sense, all the classical works I've translated, many of them resurfaced in Baudelaire. In that the first book I translated was Sappho, that was for Penguin Classics, and then I also translated Aeschylus. Sappho is very prominent in a section of the Flowers of Evil called The Flowers of Evil. There is a poem dedicated to Sappho, not dedicated, about Sappho, and then there are two versions called The Damned Women, the Damned Females, that have to do not with Sappho so much as with Sappho being from Lesbos and with lesbianism. And there, as I understand it, that section, The Flowers of Evil in The Flowers of Evil, is all about Baudelaire's perspective on, well, sex and eroticism, right? And so Sappho, it was sort of their bookends, right? That I have early on the original Sappho, and then later on this reception of Sappho that is comparatively late in Baudelaire. And so those went together. And actually, Baudelaire mentions Aeschylus, my boy Aeschylus, in an important poem in the first long section, Spleen and Ideal. Poem 18 in my volume is The Ideal. And he talks about types of females, heroes he wants. So types of females he idealizes. And he says he doesn't like them to be pale or passive or sickly, but he likes them to be blood red and violent, like Lady Macbeth, or a storm-born dream of Aeschylus. But more than that, Baudelaire's classicism, I sensed early on when I was an undergraduate, before I could even put words to it, that he would be important to me for a number of reasons. For my original work in particular, in that I too, like Baudelaire, write in traditional forms, but I want, like Baudelaire, to use living language, to use words like even slightly slangy words like stupid, as you mentioned, in this metrical and rhyming context, right? In meter and rhyme. And I see that living language being an injection of vitality into those old forms. Also, though I didn't know it then, I've learned it in finding Manhattan as my great subject. I wanted to write about the city. And when I moved to Manhattan, I knew I had found my home. And the book before my just recent book is called Manhattanite, in fact. A number of reviewers pointed out, this is before I'd even decided to translate Baudelaire, that I was presenting myself as a contemporary flaneur, or wanderer about the city of Manhattan.
Well, I won't contradict you on that point.
Yes.
as much as I have known you, that is without question the most dominant note one might have to ring when one meets you.
Oh, well, I'll take
that you are very much in the Baudelarian vein of a bohemian flaneur who makes their way through the city.
Yes, thank you. And so for all of those reasons, I was attracted to Baudelaire. But more than that, what ended up tilting me, making me decide to finally do a whole new translation of all the Flowers of Evil, actually was the coronavirus. It was what, middle of March 2020. I had left New York to go visit my mother and shop for her because she didn't want to go to the grocery store. And I got writer's block, which I never get. I pride myself on never getting writer's block, but I got it. And so what was I going to do? I turned to translation, and I started just translating Baudelaire. And so I contacted my editor at Norton, and we got a contract set up. and I just translated Baudelaire 16 hours a day because there was nothing else to do. My beard grew out. I wore sweatpants every day, and translated Baudelaire. And so that was the coronavirus. Also then got me to translate these sickly flowers, as he calls them, at one point.
So for you, this was a way of, in a way, this was a little bit of a remedy, and not a real remedy, obviously, not a vaccine, at least a little bit of a way of dealing with the pandemic, was to sort of dive into the sickly flowers, right? The very notion of sickness is so prominent throughout the Flowers of Evil. And, there's a lot I wanted to say about the Flowers of Evil thematically, but that one of them is obviously this idea that health is not the norm, but rather, and I guess I just need to zoom out here and just to say generally, it's kind of unavoidable to get kind of dark when one talks about Baudelaire.
Yeah.
So if this starts going in that direction, I just want to sort of flag the idea, right? So for Baudelaire, that's a kind of fundamental, that's fundamental to all human experience, to all human life. That's just the baseline of being human. Obviously, for him, he was syphilitic, and so illness was something that wasn't purely theoretical for him, and that was true from pretty early on in his life. I think in the mid-20s, it was in his mid-20s that he contracted it, and that he and his partner Jean Duval lived with it and suffered from it tremendously for quite a long time, till the end of his life, obviously. But it was I would think about 25 years that he lived with it. So illness is something that was very much central to what the Fleurs du Mal was about. But what's interesting, so one of the editors of the original edition, he noted that the Fleurs du Mal in French was always written with a small m. And so there was a hesitation, in other words, to treat the idea of evil as a kind of figure, in the sense of an allegorical figure. Mal would be capitalized, but at the same time, you have this kind of panoply of figures that make their way through the volume, that are sickly in some way, sort of limited. And I think one of the things that's really striking about this is that Baudelaire is, on the one hand, entirely unsympathetic to this, in the sense that he doesn't see this through the eyes of Christian charity. On the other hand, he's always sympathetic. And so, but sympathetic in a way that has to do much more with a kind of much more immediate identification with these figures, that is both a kind of sympathy, but weirdly unforgiving. And maybe that's the one way to talk about it. Was this something that, I don't know, was this something you thought about while you were translating?
Yes, a sort of escapism, I confess, given the circumstances. But also when I translate, the best analogy I can think of is, even beyond sympathy, I think of myself as like a spiritual medium, like I'm possessed by Baudelaire, so that I can then in English say what he said 200 or 175 years before. But again and again, in his poems, the turn is when he sees something awful, that's just like me, or that is my life, right? I think, quite a few poems that work that way. And so you're right, but in his description of these various things that he identifies with, he is unforgiving, as you said, in the sort of graphic, frequently disgusting descriptions of them. And then he says, but that's just like me. And we get the same identification of Baudelaire with something that is not particularly appealing in that poem you've mentioned, To the Reader. I was thinking about that poem a lot, the dedication, and it's we throughout. The pronouns are really interesting in that it starts with a we, and he seems to be talking about, well, himself. He's including himself with his bourgeois readership, if you will. And then he splits finally at the end between you and the hypocrite reader, as I translate it, my semblable, my mirror man, my twin, my frere. And so frequently he'll ends up identifying himself with something that is unappealing. I agree. That's commonly the term.
Yeah, I mean, it's really super interesting because what's fascinating, I think, is that in his poetry, one thing that always struck me is that when you pick up on a term like frère, brother, generally speaking, for example, in the 19th century sort of context of progressive or anti-monarchist, let's say, culture, a frère, like fraternité, was a really, loaded term in French discourse because it was associated with the French Revolution. But when he uses that word, first of all, it clearly doesn't operate in the register of fraternité, that we are kind of together in this, because it's a charge. It's this kind of aggression. It carries a kind of loaded sense of aggression that he brings, I think, almost to, everything on one level. At the same time, it's also weirdly kind of self-undermining, right? And there's obviously this poem, Abel and Cain, which was one of the later poems. And if I remember correctly, in that poem, I think the introduction makes this point, he actually lauds Cain for killing Abel as an act of revolt against God's order. So this is, in some ways, the term, he takes the sort of notion of fraternité, which is, a call to arms in the French Revolution, and it's not so much that he rejects it, but he kind of radicalizes it. He actually holds on to the kind of revolutionary spirit that is supposedly imbued with it, because he kind of reads that revolutionary spirit back into the mythology or the biblical narrative that he revises. So there's this kind of way in which Baudelaire is, on the one hand, deeply classicist, and as you said, really sort of learned, but very much this kind of modern revolutionary figure who is not interested in maintaining the kinds of hierarchies that classical culture was built around. And I think that's one of the great dramas that one can sort of follow through the Flowers of Evil. Maybe I wanted to ask you, like, as you were translating, was there something that, one of the things that's so hard about Baudelaire, and maybe for us to do today here, is how to sort of rediscover what is surprising about somebody who we all think we know so much about. And maybe the best way to sort of get at that is to ask you, like, was there something that really surprised you or struck you in the act of translation? Because translation is such an intimate process. I think that really there's very little that approaches it in terms of getting to know another writer's body of work.
Yes, I thought I had Baudelaire all figured out, and still until I started translating him day in and day out. And I did. There were a number of surprises, and I learned a lot. What I learned from going through the Fleurs, I guess there are three things that were most that stood out. First is the consistently high level of his work. Normally, when one reads a work as long as the Flowers of Evil, there are B-sides, if you will, right? If one can still use that analogy, right? There are poems that are better and poems that are not as interesting. But what I found myself recognizing, there's a consistently high level, and there are no B-sides, but rather only poems that one has yet to appreciate fully. I spent all this time reading and rereading Baudelaire and translating Baudelaire. And then in thinking about our conversation today, I was rereading the poems in French and in my translation, and I was still pondering over things and trying to get deeper into them and deeper into them. And so each poem has an almost, or perhaps even infinite depth. And so in that sense, it was very difficult because one's always in a learning process with Baudelaire, at least I was, and trying to figure it out. It's the translations were just a snapshot of my understanding of a poem at a certain point in time, right? But my understanding of Baudelaire will always be evolving throughout my life. And I was surprised to find that. I expected to be, okay, I'll translate the major poems and they'll be great, and there'll be a bunch of B-sides and I'll do those. But there weren't any B-sides. And it was hard, even in thinking about this presentation, to decide which poems to talk about, because each of them, yes, just merits attention, a great deal of attention. Secondly, I think of myself as a very open-minded 21st century individual, and I don't think any books should be banned. Right, I'm just opposed to the banning of books in general, right? And so I thought that I would find in these works would be material that was offensive to people in mid-19th century France, right? But that wouldn't be offensive to me. But I found material in them that made me uncomfortable. I don't think it should be banned. I translated it openly. But for example, there is, there's on a couple different occasions, there's necrophilia. And surprisingly, one instance of this where he describes in the poem, The Martyr, poem 110, he describes a decapitated woman's corpse. And then he describes, he addresses the corpse and says, yes, and he imagines a man having sex with it. And that was grotesque. And that wasn't banned. That somehow slipped through the censors. And then at another point, he imagines various degrading sexual acts. And this is in a poem that was banned, right? Poem 43X that was banned in my collection, To One Who Is Too Cheerful. And this is a poem that starts out in the country. He gives us a kind of flower dance. He builds it up as this beautiful, happy, sort of paradise. And then he talks about how much he hates it and he abominates the woman for coming from there. And he wants to sneak into her bedroom at night. Yes, we get it's a description of forced fellatio to inject his poison. And this is one of the poems that was banned. And as I understand it, because he'd contracted syphilis at a young age, the poison was interpreted by a lot of people as his disease. And that is, if that's he did not agree with that interpretation, but if that was his original intent, that is just revolting. I mean, it's remarkable, but it's absolutely revolting. Still don't think it should be banned. And then also, thirdly, I was not aware that Baudelaire interacted so closely with the art of the day. I knew that he was an art critic, but in his own poetry, I did not know that he was so involved with contemporary art, describing works by his friends and contemporaries in ekphrasis, which is a literary description of a work of art. and then also giving in poem 6, which I translate as Beacons, giving a kind of an homage to his favorite artists, including Delacroix, whom you mentioned. And so poem 13, one of my favorite poems, Traveling Gypsies, in fact, is an ekphrosis of an engraving by an early 17th century French artist, Jacques Collot. It's actually in the Princeton Art Museum. There is a print of it in the Princeton Art Museum. I was looking at it today. And he describes it in ekphrosis, the first 2 quatrains, and then moves on to imagine what they're moving towards and what happens as they move through it. And so that was all very surprising for me as well, that I got this sort of education in French art for several centuries, just by working on Baudelaire and having to write the notes for it.
Well, it's really interesting that, well, all of that is interesting, but I think it's really interesting that you talk about B-sides, because I think another way to talk about Baudelaire is that it's all B-sides.
Oh, and got it. Yes.
Right. And, this is, again, I feel like I'm going to trot out a lot of cliches, but he's known as the first sort of rock star, or the first punk star, punk rocker, or maybe the first goth, all of which I believe are fundamentally true, in the sense that there is a kind of deep kind of alienation that he expresses relative to not just the society around him. In some ways, I actually think that's less true than to the ideals that society claims to hold up as its aspirations, right? Ideals of beauty, ideals of morality that he saw as being hypocritical. Obviously, the Christian world that he is very much part of, and I think participates in. He, I think, was a fairly regular churchgoer. He was not, but at the same time, that entire universe is again flipped on its head, and so the Flowers of Evil is a Christian world, but seen from the standpoint of the devil, of Satan, as the primary actor in the world, rather than a kind of redeeming God. You mentioned you mentioned a couple of poems, and I wondered the B-sidedness. That the other thing I wanted to say about that, which I think is so interesting, is that one aspect of that I think is interesting is that he was interested not just in ideas. He was clearly very much of a sort of metaphysical poet. He was well read in philosophy and other things, but he was also interested in simply producing poetry that had immediate effects. And again, famously, Walter Benjamin, the German literary scholar and philosopher, theorized this as what he called shock effects. Baudelaire wanted to shock people. He believed that that was the way that poetry could operate within modern culture. And he thought that that was the most appropriate thing to do to his reader, right? Which is to produce experiences of shock that would in some ways disrupt or remind them that they exist not merely as workers in a kind of machine, a sort of, well-oiled kind of existence that one associates with bourgeois life, but rather as like something that is driven by a sensorium, a diverse sensorium. And I know you want to talk about this, and I already invoked this idea of harmony and melody. But of course, one of the things that is always striking, one of the other poems that they banned was a poem called Les Bijoux, where he talks about his lover, Jean Duval, being nude. But he speaks about this idea of bijoux sonores, sound jewels, which is a catachresis. It's a fundamentally contradictory idea. And I know that you were really interested in this kind of oral, or rather in the sense of orality, and sound dimension of his poetry. And does the B-side that you talk about here, does that come forward in that particular sort of dimension of his poems? Because it seems like you paid a lot of attention to that.
Yes, and also mentioning the catachresis and the sound jewels makes me think of another poem that isn't frequently discussed, that is a kind of B-side. And I like that you said, yeah, in a sense, yeah, they're all B-sides. It's the B-side movement. He is the B-side movement. But the poem To a Madonna, he imagines dolling up his own Madonna scene, and he says he's going to make a crown for her, and the jewels in the crown will be his rhymes. Yes. And then he goes on to describe other details.
Yeah.
And so there's more, of that conflation of sound and jewelry, or sound and glitter, in that poem To a Madonna as well. Yes, that's interesting. I mean, you're right, to invert that, to say all the poems, rather than trying to be pop hits, end up being, B-sides.
That's why they are pop hits, right? Like he famously said, I want to invent a cliche. That's kind of in some sense, I think, what a pop hit is. I'm looking at the time, Aaron, and I know you wanted to read some poetry. Speaking of B-sides, should we dive into that?
Yes,
and,
please.
Share some of the B-sides here?
Yes.
So, did you want me to read first in French?
Please do.
Okay, so why don't we start with the Traveling Gypsies, which in French is the Bohémien en voyage. Is that
all right?
Which is the poem you were talking about that was based on the what is it, engraving or a painting?
An engraving by
Jacques
Collot. Yes.
Okay, so let me just go ahead. Bohémien en voyage. La tribu prophétique aux prunelles ardentes, hier s'est mise en route en portant ses petits sur son dos ou livrant à leur fier appétit le trésor toujours près des mamelles pendantes. Les hommes vont à pied sous leurs armes luisantes, le long des chariots où les leurs sont blottis, promenant sur le ciel des yeux appesantis par le morne regret des chimères absentes. Du fond de son réduit sablonneux, le grillon, le regardant passer, redouble sa chanson, si belle, qui les aime, augmente ses verdures, fait couler le rocher et fleurir le désert devant ses voyageurs, pour lesquels est ouvert l'empire familier des ténèbres futures.
Traveling Gypsies. The fire-eyed tribe of prophets left last night. Some had their kids strapped to their backs, while others fed powerful infant famishment, a mother's opulence from a loose and dangling tit. The men now walk with gleaming weaponry alongside wagons loaded with their kin. Their eyes rendered heavy by a wan regret for lost illusions, scan the sky. The cricket, in his sandy solitude, seeing them passing, plays a louder tune. Kibbley, doting, makes the trees more green, makes rock jet water and the desert bloom before these travelers for whom, as home, the coming darkness's dominion opens wide.
Okay, so the next one is Harmony of the Evening, Harmonie du Soir in French. Voici venir les temps où vibrant sur sa tige, chaque fleur s'évapore ainsi qu'un encensoir. Les sons et les parfums tournent dans l'air du soir, valse mélancolique et langoureux vertige. Chaque fleur s'évapore ainsi qu'un encensoir. Le violon frémit comme un cœur qu'on afflige. Valse mélancolique et langoureux vertige. Le ciel est triste et beau comme un grand reposoir. Le violon frémit comme un cœur qu'on afflige, un cœur tendre qui est le néant, vaste et noir. Le ciel est triste et beau comme un grand reposoir. Le soleil s'est noyé dans son sang qui se fige. Un cœur tendre qui est le néant, vaste et noir. Du passé lumineux recueille tout vestige. Le soleil s'est noyé dans son sang qui se fige. Ton souvenir en moi, lui, comme un ostensoir.
The harmony of evening. Right now, the stems are quivering. Right now, flowers like censers loose, each a bouquet. Sounds and perfumes are mingling in the sky, a mournful waltz, a languid vertigo. Flowers like censers loose, each a bouquet. The trembling violin is full of woe, a mournful waltz, a languid vertigo. The sky, an altar cloth, is shadowy. The trembling violin is full of woe, a tender heart that hates vacuity. The sky, an altar cloth, is shadowy. The sun is sliding down like dark blood flow. A tender heart that hates vacuity gathers up emblems of a bygone glow. The sun is sliding down like dark blood flow. You, like a monstrance, light my memory.
I know you wanted to read the Swan also, but I can't help asking you, I didn't actually know that this was a form called is it called the pantoum?
The pantoum, a Malayan form. Yes, it's a kind of pantoum. And it's become increasingly popular actually in the 20th century. Not so different. It has some similarities to the villanelle in that there are repetends, there are lines that are repeated. But it consists entirely of, repeated lines. Yes, and so generally the A rhymes end up being repeated, yes, in a consistent pattern. It's very technical. We could get into it, but it is, yes, the pantoum.
So I collected a bunch of, sort of quotations by other writers about Baudelaire.
Oh, yes.
Which I meant to read early on, but in the flow I didn't. But I thought it would be interesting in the context of this poem to read one. I have a couple. One is by Jules Laforgue, who's a early 20th century French poet, very much a kind of radical figure. And he kind of noted a whole bunch of firsts that he credited Baudelaire with. And I'll just read a couple of these because I think a couple really come forward in the poem that we just read. The first who talked about Paris as an everyday damned being of the capital. It's not so much in this poem. The first who talked about himself in a kind of confessional mode without an inspired style. Also not so much this poem. The first who brought into our literature boredom in the midst of pleasure and its bizarre setting, the sad bedroom. That's not quite in this poem either, but it also is, because I think Harmonie du Soir is very much thematically closely related to this. So what I find really striking about the kind of B-sidedness of this poem, this kind of, because it's in some ways it's a very archaic form, if I understand. It's like close to something like a rondel, like it's a Renaissance form.
Yeah.
There is this kind of rote dimension that seems to be moving through it. This is very much a machine, and that as opposed to simply this idea of lyrical voice as the expression of the self. And I think that is very powerfully, sort of present here. I wanted to also read this passage by my friend Alyssa Martyr, who is one of the great Baudelaire specialists in the United States, who teaches down at Emory University. And I think she speaks to very much what we're talking about here. But she talks about his in terms of this idea of bad sex. So this kind of machinal or machinic. Let me read this poem. Baudelaire appeals to beauty to undo the damage done by the so-called natural order, to bear witness to the world that is left out of familiar cycles of production and reproduction, and to remake the world by other means. For Baudelaire, the motif of quote unquote bad sex becomes a kind of gestural language, a poetic medium, and a form of theatricality that conjures up actions, events, and figures that escape other modes of representation. Beauty's work is neither presentation nor representation, but something like an artificial alternative to birth. And if there's a poem that, in a way, it's very much in the sort of highly structured way that Harmonie du Soir really presents itself, speaks to this idea. I think this must be it. And it's always spoken about in terms of its lyricism and its musicality. But what's striking to me here is that it's not lyricism in a traditional sense, Aaron. It's a kind of weirdly, I don't know if staccato is the right word. It has a kind of rhythm, but it is a rhythm that's somewhere between poetry and prose. That
makes sense. I also like your description of these repeating forms, the pantoum in particular, as mechanized or machine-like. I agree with that. When I teach my students to write pantoums, generally we tell them the problem with these repeating forms, whether it be a villanelle or a pantoum, is that the poem doesn't go anywhere, right? It's hard. But Baudelaire, being a genius, gives us these new lines at the ending, right? Rather than bringing the opening lines around at the so that's repetition at the end, he gives us new lines, and he gives us that image of the monstrance at the end from the Catholic Church, lighting up, and as he says, my memory. And that's where we get suddenly that shift, the turn to the second person, and we get religion brought in. And so the ending really goes somewhere, is a kind of final turn for the poem. And so, yes, this pantoum actually gives us a surprise, and actually it seems to be surprisingly for Baudelaire, sort of reassuring and almost sweet, as I see it at the end. And that is pretty rare in Baudelaire. Yeah.
But what's interesting is that the only thing that offers that for him is the memory. It's in French, it's ton souvenir en moi. It's something that only exists within him, and it's certainly not something that exists in the world. And he had to produce it through this kind of poetic machine, right? Like in some ways, that's what a bijou sonore is. It's this kind of internal state that one achieves. It's about sensibility. Robert Calasso, who just recently died, the Italian writer, he wrote, and speaking about the shock value that Baudelaire wanted to sort of, cultivate, he said, it's not something that concerns the power or the perfection of form. It concerns sensibility. And the distinction there is this idea that shock value is something fundamentally internal. It's not ultimately about form, or it's not about formalism or anti-formalism. It's not about let's say the devolution of traditional forms, because certainly that doesn't happen in his poetry. And it's one of the reasons I find it interesting that you are, in some ways, one of the most appropriate people I can think of to translate Baudelaire, because For him, the classical forms in their artifice became the means for expressing what was a fundamentally sort of modern experience of sensibility and shock. And I think that really, I think I really hear that a lot in what you tried to do with this poem. Should we move on to the Swan?
Yes. Yes, I think we should. I would love to hear it. And so, and especially since we were just talking about memory.
Yeah.
And this will be, yes, we'll see how much time we have. But this poem works really well and talking about, okay, got it. Yes, read the Swan, then we'll roll into questions. And I hope we have, yeah, I hope we'll have time. Great.
That sounds good. Okay. Le cygne. Andromaque, je pense à vous, ce petit fleuve pauvre et triste miroir où jadis resplendit l'immense majesté de vos douleurs de veuve. Ceci, moi, menteur, qui par vos pleurs grandit, a fécondé soudain ma mémoire fertile, comme je traversais le nouveau carrousel. Le vieux Paris n'est plus, la forme d'une ville change plus vite, hélas, que le cœur d'un mortel. Je ne vois qu'en l'esprit tout ce camp de baraques, ces tas de chapiteaux ébauchés de fûts, les herbes, les gros blocs verdis par l'eau des flaques, et, brillant au carreau, le bric-à-brac confus. Là s'étalait jadis une ménagerie. Là je vis un matin à l'heure où, sous les cieux, froid éclair, le travail s'éveille, où la voirie pousse un sombre ouragan dans l'air silencieux. Un cygne qui s'était évadé de sa cage et de ses pieds palmés frottant le pavé sec, sur le sol raboteux traînait son blanc plumage. Près d'un ruisseau sans eau, la bête ouvrant le bec, baignait nerveusement ses ailes dans la poudre et disait, le cœur plein de son beau lac natal, « Oh, quand donc pluvras-tu? Quand tonneras-tu foudre? Je vois ce malheureux mythe étrange et fatal vers le ciel quelquefois comme l'homme d'Ovide, vers le ciel ironique et cruellement bleu, sur son cou convulsif tendant sa tête avide, comme il s'adressait des reproches à Dieu. Paris change, mais rien dans ma mélancolie n'a bougé. Palais neuf, échafaudage, bloc, vieux faubourg, tout pour moi devient allégorie, et mes chers souvenirs sont plus lourds que des rocs. Aussi devant ce Louvre, une image m'opprime. Je pense à mon grand cygne avec ses gestes fous, comme les exilés ridicules et sublimes, et rongés d'un désir sans trêve. Et puis à vous, Andromaque, des bras d'un grand époux tombé, vil bétail, sous la main du superbe Pyrrhus, auprès d'un tombeau vide en extase courbée, veuve d'Hector, hélas, et femme d'Hélénus. Je pense à la négresse amaigrie et physique, piétinant dans la boue et cherchant l'œil hagard, les cocotiers absents et la superbe d'Afrique, derrière la muraille immense du brouillard. À quiconque a perdu ce qui ne se retrouve jamais, jamais, à ceux qui s'abreuvent de pleurs et têtent la douleur comme une bonne louve, aux maigres orphelins séchant comme des fleurs, ainsi dans la forêt où mon esprit s'exile, un vieux souvenir sonne à plein souffle du corps. Je pense aux matelots oubliés dans une île, aux captifs, aux vaincus, à bien d'autres encore.
The Swan. That's beautiful. Thank you. The Swan, 1. My thoughts all turn to you, Andromache, that little stream, that mournful looking glass that caught your whole widowhood's majesty, the tears you shed to feed that Simois, had quickened in my fecund recollection as I walked through the modern carousel. The old Paris is gone. A town's complexion, like human hearts, never stays put at all. I picture in my mind the camp of shacks, the rough-hewn column drums and capitals, the weeds, the puddles, mossing up huge blocks and mirroring the bric-a-brac and frills. The place once hosted a menagerie, and here's what I saw there at just the hour when work wakes up and greets the cool black sky and sweepers push dust storms into the air. A swan who had somehow found freedom, passed clumsily, wings laid flat along the walk, his wealth of feathers draggled in the dust. Right by a ditch, he opened up his beak, flapping excitedly, wings on the ground, heart roused by lakes he once was giddy with. He said, "Come on and rain, sky, thunder, sound." I see him as a strange and fatal myth, toward the ironic sky, as in some book of Ovid, towards the cruel blue, his head kept bobbing up atop a shaky neck, as if he were abominating God. 2. Though Paris changes, nothing in my sorry state has budged. Blocks, palaces tacked on, old districts, all to me are allegory. My dear remembrances weigh more than stone. A sight outside the Louvre hits home. I think of that big swan who struggled in his woe, an exile, a sublime and antic thing consumed by longing. And I think of you, Andromache, torn from a husband's love, base property of Pyrrhus's rough pride, head bowed to rave beside an empty grave, widow of Hector, Helenus' bride. I think of a black girl, tubercular, searching with tired eyes as she slogs through mud for palms she knew in Africa somewhere, behind a massive barrier of cloud. Of all deprived of something they may not find ever, ever again, whose tears are streams, who suck a grief milk from the she-wolf's tit, of skinny orphans, of decaying blooms. Thus, in the woods that house my exiled soul, hoary remembrance blares a cri de coeur. I think of sailors stranded on an isle, of captives, the defeated, many more. Let's see if there's some questions from our viewers. Thank you. Stephen asks, which poem stumped you the most as you translated it and why? Well, I actually do have an answer to that question. Once in a while, there's no denying it, I left it out of the things that I found offensive in Baudelaire. We get a whiff of anti-Semitism in Baudelaire. And it is terribly upsetting given subsequent history. And so there's a poem that has only a title is just its first line, poem 32. Once sleeping with a horrid Jewish crone, he says. We slept like corpses. He's sleeping with a Jewish prostitute, and while he's lying with her, he imagines a past girlfriend. And I struggled with getting the tone right and whether I should translate it at all, but I knew I had to be faithful and to have the complete Flowers of Evil. And so I wrote and rewrote many drafts of that. And I actually sent the drafts to my former graduate advisor, who in addition to being a classicist, Nita Crevens, knows French very well. And we hammered it out. And I ended up being happy with what I ended up with. But it was an upsetting and not entirely pleasant process, I must confess. So poem 32. Oh, yes. Casey asks, did you reference other translations as you worked on this project? Did you have a favorite? Yes, I referenced a number of other translations. The one I know the best is by a a poet who was a mentor of mine at Columbia, Richard Howard. And I like his translations very much. He works in form as much as he translates into syllabics in English. He does syllabics in English. But I ended up feeling that there was a need for a new Baudelaire translation, as much as I like his and respect his, in that there needed to be a translation of Baudelaire into rhyme, right? Because the sound is so important to me, so incantatory in the original. Most of the attempts at rhyming translations struck me as clumsy or ineffectual or dated. And so there needed to be a rhyming translation in our contemporary idiom. Yes, I hope. What translations do you have coming out next? Yes, thank you for asking. I actually think Baudelaire might be my last translation. Mic drop. No, I regard translation as well, a way of honing my craft, right? And also of expanding the range of voices that I have inside of me. Voices that, and so I have Sappho inside of me and Baudelaire inside of me and all kinds of different authors, and they expand my range and give me different voices. But I feel I'm at an age now where it's time for me to focus exclusively on my own work, right? I mean, it's kind of late, but my apprenticeship, my long unending apprenticeship, I guess should be over. And that it's time for me to turn exclusively to my own work. And so we'll see. Never say never, but I think this might be my last translation.
Baudelaire just filled you up too much. He took up so
it
much.
was exhausting. It was.
Which,
exhausting.
by the way, is what happened precisely to, his paragons, to, whatever. This is now boring scholarly conversation about how he, he was one of these figures who very much swallowed up the creativity, and who younger people coming after him both felt like they had to, sort of equal, and yet could never. So that was, I think, a challenge always for people.
Very well. Are there more questions?
I think that was maybe the last one.
All right. Well, that's good. Yes. Hello. That's all we have. Feel free to say your thank yous. Well, Saul, thank you very much for doing this. You've dedicated a lot of time to organizing a presentation for this evening. And I'd like to thank 192 Books also for hosting this event, and the gallery. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really had a great time. Thank you, Aaron, for inviting me to do this with you. Thank you to Evan and Victoria and 192. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Take care.
Thank you so much to Aaron Poochigian and Saul Anton for that wonderful discussion. That was incredibly enlightening, and we really appreciate your time. So thank you so much. A recording of this event will be posted immediately after we finish streaming. So if you missed the beginning or you want to share it with a friend, it'll be ready in just a few minutes. All of our previous events are available to watch as well on paulacooperstudio.com. If you'd like to reserve Aaron's book, send us an email at info@192books.com, or you can also come by our shop, which is open from 11 to 7 every day. If you can't make it down to Chelsea, another option is to order from our bookshop.org page for direct shipment. And finally, if you'd like information on upcoming events, you can sign up for our email newsletter or check our website, 192books.com. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us and have a great night.